In the spring of 1945, the Battle of Okinawa raged on, becoming one of the fiercest and bloodiest confrontations of World War II. This battle, fought on the island of Okinawa, Japan, saw the U.S. Army and Marines face an entrenched Japanese defense force, determined to make their final stand in a complex system of caves and tunnels carved into the island's rugged, rocky terrain. These tunnels were their last line of defense, and the Japanese were prepared to fight to the death to protect their homeland. The battle began in early April, with U.S. forces landing on Okinawa and quickly encountering heavy resistance. For weeks, the Americans struggled to make any significant progress. The Japanese defenders had anticipated the invasion long before the first American soldiers set foot on the island. They had spent months digging and fortifying a complex underground network of caves and tunnels that spanned across the island. The Japanese believed this underground system would shield them from the overwhelming firepower of the U.S. forces, providing them with a safe haven from artillery bombardments and airstrikes. This network, though hidden from the eyes of the invaders, was designed for one purpose: to force a protracted fight and wear down the Americans, hoping they would be driven into a costly stalemate. Initially, the U.S. military expected the Japanese to fight in more conventional ways, much like in previous island battles, where the enemy would engage in open confrontations. However, the Japanese defenders refused to fight in the open. Instead, they retreated into their underground positions, emerging only to launch sudden ambushes on advancing American forces. The Japanese soldiers fired from concealed positions, making it nearly impossible for the Americans to pinpoint their exact locations. This strategy caused heavy casualties among the U.S. forces and slowed their progress considerably, much to the frustration of the Americans, who found themselves locked in a deadly battle with a hidden and elusive enemy. By the end of April, it became evident that the traditional tactics of heavy bombardment and open assaults would not suffice to break the Japanese defenses. The Americans needed a new solution, something that could penetrate the fortified positions and flush the defenders out. It was at this point that the U.S. military decided to deploy flamethrowers, a powerful weapon designed to clear entrenched positions by setting them on fire. Though flamethrowers were not new to the U.S. military, their use in Okinawa marked a critical turning point. These flamethrowers were mounted on tanks, giving U.S. forces the ability to project a sustained stream of fire while staying at a safer distance. Others were carried by infantrymen, who had to get much closer to the enemy positions. These weapons could project a jet of fire up to 50 feet, which proved to be enough to reach deep into the Japanese caves and flush out the defenders hiding inside. The initial reaction from the Japanese defenders was shock. They had never faced such a weapon before. In the narrow tunnels and caves, the flames had nowhere to escape, causing the heat and smoke to build up rapidly. For those caught in the flames, there was little chance of survival. The fires would burn through anything in their path: human flesh, clothing, and supplies alike. Soldiers were burned alive, unable to escape the blazing inferno. The psychological terror was just as powerful as the physical destruction. Many of the Japanese soldiers, faced with such a horrific death, chose to take their own lives rather than endure the agony of being burned alive. The flamethrowers caused fear, panic, and chaos, reshaping the nature of the battle. For the U.S. forces, the flamethrowers were an effective tool, but they came with risks of their own. The soldiers operating the flamethrowers had to get very close to the enemy positions, which made them vulnerable to Japanese gunfire. The soldiers carrying the flamethrowers or operating the flamethrower-equipped tanks were prime targets. In many cases, if these soldiers were hit, the flamethrowers could explode, sending deadly flames in every direction. The risks were high, but the results were undeniable. The flamethrowers helped the Americans clear out Japanese strongholds that had once seemed invincible, turning the tide of the battle. Despite the shock of the flamethrowers, the Japanese defenders did not immediately surrender. Instead, they fought even harder. Many soldiers, having seen their comrades burn to death, were determined to hold their positions. Some resisted until the very end, choosing to die rather than give up. Even as the flames consumed their comrades, the Japanese soldiers continued to fight from within the tunnels, refusing to yield. The battle for control of the island became more personal and brutal as each side struggled to outlast the other. The Americans realized that despite their new weapon, this battle was not going to be over quickly. By May, U.S. forces began to gain ground, but the cost of the fight was steep. The use of flamethrowers, while effective in clearing the caves and tunnels, had added a new layer of horror to the battle. Soldiers on both sides faced the psychological strain of close combat, often in complete darkness and in spaces where escape was impossible. The fear of being burned alive added an even greater sense of terror to the already brutal fight. For the U.S. military, the flamethrowers had allowed them to break through the once impenetrable Japanese defenses. The Japanese had relied heavily on their underground network to survive, but the flamethrowers rendered those defenses useless. The Americans were able to push the Japanese forces back, inch by inch, through the labyrinth of tunnels. The Japanese soldiers were forced to retreat deeper into the island as the American forces made their way through their defenses. However, the battle was far from over. Despite the advantages of the flamethrowers, the Americans continued to face stiff resistance. The Japanese defenders fought with fierce determination, willing to sacrifice themselves rather than surrender. The U.S. forces pushed forward, but at a heavy cost. The use of flamethrowers had turned the battle into a brutal and personal struggle, one that would leave deep scars on the soldiers who fought there. The battle for Okinawa continued for weeks, but the use of flamethrowers had marked a significant shift in tactics. The weapon, while devastating in its effectiveness, had also changed the nature of warfare on the island. The flames that consumed the Japanese defenders in the caves of Okinawa were not just a tool of destruction. They symbolized the harsh, unrelenting reality of a war that was drawing toward its bloody conclusion. As the battle neared its end, Okinawa would forever be remembered as a symbol of both destruction and determination. It was a battle that would leave lasting scars on the soldiers who fought there, as well as the land they fought to control. The brutal effectiveness of the flamethrowers and the unyielding resistance of the Japanese defenders would continue to resonate long after the battle had ended. The U.S. military used flamethrowers as a key weapon in the Battle of Okinawa. These flamethrowers, such as the M1 and M2 models, were designed for close combat. The M1 and M2 flamethrowers could project a sustained stream of fire that reached up to 50 feet. This gave U.S. soldiers the ability to clear entrenched positions, including caves and tunnels, where the enemy was hiding. These flamethrowers were mounted on tanks, allowing troops to stay at a safer distance, while some were carried by infantrymen who had to get much closer to the enemy. The flamethrowers could unleash a wall of fire capable of burning anything in its path. The fire was so intense that it could clear out positions that artillery and airstrikes failed to destroy. In places like caves and tunnels, where conventional weapons struggled to have an effect, flamethrowers proved essential. They forced Japanese defenders to either abandon their positions or face certain death. Japanese forces had carefully planned for the defense of Okinawa, building an extensive network of caves and tunnels. These underground shelters were meant to protect them from the heavy bombardment that U.S. forces used in earlier phases of the battle. The network was designed to resist both aerial and artillery attacks, offering a hidden advantage. From within these caves and tunnels, Japanese soldiers would emerge unexpectedly to launch ambushes or fire on advancing U.S. troops. The Japanese had built the tunnels so well that they were nearly impossible to penetrate with conventional tactics. The tunnels were not just simple holes in the ground. They were carefully constructed systems that ran deep into the island's terrain. Some tunnels stretched for hundreds of yards and contained rooms for sleeping, eating, and preparing for battle. The entrances to these tunnels were hidden, often camouflaged in vegetation or behind natural rock formations, making them difficult for the U.S. military to locate. The defenders could move between the tunnels without being detected, creating a significant challenge for U.S. forces trying to secure the island. The main advantage of the tunnels was that they allowed Japanese soldiers to survive intense bombardment. U.S. airstrikes and artillery shells would explode above ground, but the tunnels kept the defenders safe. This underground defense system also allowed the Japanese to regroup, ambush American soldiers, and attack when least expected. The tunnels offered protection, mobility, and surprise, all critical elements for the Japanese in a battle they knew they had to fight with limited resources. However, as the battle wore on, the Americans realized that conventional tactics were not enough to defeat the Japanese defenders. The U.S. forces had already tried heavy bombing and shelling to destroy the tunnel network, but it had little effect. The Japanese defenders were still able to move, regroup, and strike. This led U.S. commanders to look for other methods to deal with the entrenched Japanese forces. Flamethrowers were introduced as an answer. These weapons were different from standard rifles or artillery. Rather than relying on explosive force to destroy targets, flamethrowers used fire to destroy positions. They were effective against the hidden, hard-to-reach Japanese defenders who had taken refuge in the tunnels. The U.S. troops began to use flamethrowers on a regular basis, both mounted on tanks and in infantry teams. These flamethrowers could clear out entire cave systems by forcing the Japanese defenders to either fight back in open ground or die in the flames. The effectiveness of flamethrowers was especially clear in the tunnels, where conventional weapons could not reach. The M1 and M2 flamethrowers were key to this effort. The M1 was the first model used in combat. It was a portable flamethrower that could be carried by soldiers and fired from a shoulder mount. This version had a range of about 25 feet, which was useful for clearing out smaller, more confined spaces. The M2 was an upgraded version mounted on tanks and capable of firing a much longer stream of fire. These flamethrowers gave U.S. troops an advantage in close-quarters combat, especially when dealing with fortified enemy positions in tunnels. The Japanese had not expected such a weapon to be used against them. Their underground positions had been designed to withstand conventional bombardment, but the flamethrowers rendered their tunnels useless. The fire would spread through the narrow passages, filling the tunnels with smoke and intense heat. Those inside had nowhere to go, and many were forced to surrender or perish. The psychological impact of facing such a weapon was significant. Japanese soldiers, who had relied on the protection of the tunnels, now found themselves trapped and exposed. The Japanese defenders were not passive, however. They fought to the end, determined to hold their positions. The tunnels, while vulnerable to fire, were still a valuable defense. Some soldiers tried to escape the flames, running out of the tunnels or attempting to reach other underground positions. Others fought back with their own weapons, hoping to take down as many American soldiers as possible before being overwhelmed. Despite the effectiveness of the flamethrowers, the battle was far from easy. U.S. soldiers still faced stiff resistance, with many suffering casualties from Japanese counterattacks. In the end, flamethrowers played a crucial role in breaking the stalemate created by the Japanese tunnels and caves. They allowed U.S. forces to neutralize the hidden defenses that had been so effective in slowing the American advance. But it came at a cost. The flamethrowers were dangerous for the soldiers using them. They had to get close to the enemy, which put them at risk of being hit by enemy fire or having their flamethrower tanks explode. The close-quarters nature of the fighting made every step a risky one. The extensive network of tunnels built by the Japanese in Okinawa proved to be a formidable challenge for U.S. forces. But through the use of flamethrowers, the Americans were able to overcome this challenge. The flamethrowers provided a way to clear out enemy positions that seemed impenetrable. They changed the course of the battle, forcing the Japanese to abandon their underground strongholds or face certain destruction. The success of the flamethrowers in Okinawa marked a significant shift in how warfare would be conducted in the Pacific, especially in battles where the enemy used fortified positions. At first, the Battle of Okinawa had become a brutal stalemate. U.S. forces had been fighting their way through the island, but progress was slow. The Japanese defenders had dug in deep. They had built a network of caves and tunnels designed to protect them from the heavy air and artillery bombardments the Americans were using. These tunnels were well hidden, often camouflaged within the natural terrain, making it nearly impossible for U.S. forces to locate and destroy them. The Americans had expected the Japanese to fight in the open, as they had in earlier battles. Instead, the defenders used their underground system to their advantage, launching surprise attacks from concealed positions. This new tactic, combined with the dense vegetation and rugged terrain, created a deadly situation for the U.S. forces. Every advance was met with gunfire from hidden positions, making it hard for the Americans to gain ground. The soldiers faced ambushes and sniper fire, often with no idea where the enemy was firing from. Even with the overwhelming air and artillery superiority the U.S. had, the situation seemed almost impossible to break. For weeks, the U.S. forces tried to clear these positions using traditional methods. Airstrikes and artillery bombardments were the primary tools used. But these powerful attacks had little effect on the entrenched defenders. The Japanese soldiers would simply retreat deeper into the tunnels, where they were safe from the blasts. The situation was growing more desperate. The Americans had to find another way to break the stalemate. Then they introduced flamethrowers into the fight. These weapons had been used before, but their role was now more critical than ever. Flamethrowers mounted on tanks and carried by soldiers were brought to the front lines. Unlike artillery or bombs, flamethrowers could deliver a sustained stream of fire capable of reaching deep into the tunnels. They were perfect for clearing the kind of entrenched positions the Japanese had created. The flames would crawl into the small openings of the caves, forcing the defenders to either come out or burn alive. It was a terrifying new tactic that changed the dynamic of the battle. The first use of flamethrowers in Okinawa shocked the Japanese defenders. They had never faced such a weapon before. The idea that fire could be used to flush them out of their underground shelters was something they hadn't prepared for. The flames filled the tunnels, creating an unbearable environment. The smoke, the heat, the burning. Inside the confined spaces, it was nearly impossible to escape. The walls of the tunnels would trap the heat, turning these safe havens into death traps. The horror of being trapped in a tunnel, unable to escape, was devastating. Many soldiers inside had no choice but to fight to the death, refusing to surrender. Some preferred to die by their own hand rather than be burned alive in the flames. The flamethrowers didn't just cause physical damage. They had a profound psychological effect. The idea of being burned alive in a confined space was an agonizing prospect that no one could easily endure. Despite the overwhelming effectiveness of the flamethrowers, the Japanese defenders did not surrender easily. Even as the flames poured into their tunnels, many fought back with everything they had. Some soldiers charged out of the caves, armed with rifles or grenades, hoping to take down the U.S. troops before they were consumed by the fire. The fight was not over just because the flamethrowers were in play. The Japanese forces were determined to resist. The soldiers using the flamethrowers were just as vulnerable. While the weapon was effective at flushing out entrenched enemy soldiers, the soldiers using it had to get close. The flamethrower tanks on the front lines were targets for Japanese gunfire, and many U.S. soldiers carrying portable flamethrowers were at risk of being shot or caught in an explosion if the tanks were hit. They had to advance toward the enemy, knowing full well that they were placing themselves in harm's way. Each step forward could mean their own death, but the use of flamethrowers offered a chance to break the stalemate and shift the battle in their favor. The shock of the flamethrowers on both sides made the fighting even more intense. For the Americans, the weapon provided a sense of relief. They could finally clear the caves and tunnels, where the enemy had been hiding and launching ambushes. For the Japanese, the flamethrowers represented a new, terrifying force. They had expected airstrikes and artillery, but the fire that came pouring from the flamethrowers was something different. It was immediate, close, and devastating. As the battle went on, the U.S. forces began to use flamethrowers more frequently. They were becoming an essential tool in the fight against the Japanese defenders. With each use, the flames would cut through the layers of defense the Japanese had built. The tunnels that had once been a sanctuary for the defenders were now their graveyards. The flames forced them out or burned them alive, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. The psychological toll on the Japanese soldiers was heavy. The horror of being trapped in a fiery death trap led many to take their own lives rather than face capture or the flames. But for every Japanese soldier who surrendered or died, there was another who fought until the very end. The Japanese defenders, despite the overwhelming odds, never fully gave up. They continued to use their tunnels, emerging when least expected to launch counterattacks. Even as the U.S. forces pushed forward, the Japanese resistance remained strong. The flamethrowers had changed the nature of the battle, but they did not end it. The fight for Okinawa was still far from over. As the U.S. forces pressed on, the flamethrowers continued to play a key role. The Japanese defenders were forced into increasingly desperate positions. Their tunnels were no longer a safe place. The Americans, however, had to keep pushing forward, facing not just the entrenched enemy but the intense fear of being burned alive. Every soldier knew the risk of using the flamethrowers, but it was a risk that was necessary to break the deadlock. The battle for Okinawa was becoming a brutal, unforgiving war of attrition, where every step forward cost blood, sweat, and fire. For U.S. soldiers, the flamethrowers were both a relief and a source of moral conflict. On one hand, the weapon gave them a powerful tool to break through the entrenched positions of the Japanese defenders. The Americans had been locked in a deadly stalemate for weeks, unable to move forward because of the well-hidden caves and tunnels where the Japanese were dug in. The flamethrowers allowed the U.S. forces to finally clear out these positions. With each shot, they could hear the crackle of fire and know that another enemy stronghold was being wiped out. It felt like a decisive turning point in the battle. Yet, with the effectiveness came a heavy emotional toll. The flamethrower was not just a weapon, it was a brutal, close-range tool of destruction. Soldiers knew that it didn't just kill. It burned. It scorched everything in its path, including human flesh. Some of the men operating the flamethrowers felt relief at the effectiveness of the weapon, but others found the brutality of it unsettling. The idea that a single burst of fire could destroy an entire position, and the people within it, was hard to ignore. The flames would burn through tunnels, destroying not just the soldiers but everything in their way. This left many of the men grappling with complex emotions. There was pride in the success of the weapon. The flamethrowers allowed the U.S. forces to gain ground where other methods had failed. But the soldiers also had to wrestle with feelings of revulsion. They had seen the horrors of war before, but this weapon made them face something even more terrifying. Some soldiers recoiled at the thought of what they had done. The flames didn't just kill the enemy. They forced them into a horrible, burning death. The moral conflict weighed heavily on the soldiers who were using these weapons. They couldn't help but wonder about the suffering they had caused. They had made it possible to defeat the enemy, but at what cost? As the battle continued, the emotional burden of using flamethrowers only grew. The soldiers would look at the blackened remnants of a tunnel, knowing that the fire had consumed everything inside. For many of them, it was hard to separate the task at hand from the human cost. The death was real, and the suffering was visible. It wasn't just about killing an enemy. It was about destroying everything that stood in their way. Some soldiers struggled with the idea that they were fighting not just for victory but for the complete eradication of the enemy, leaving behind nothing but ashes. On the other side, the Japanese defenders were faced with a horror they had never anticipated. When the Americans began using flamethrowers, the Japanese soldiers inside the tunnels were completely caught off guard. They had spent weeks hiding in these caves, believing they were safe from airstrikes and artillery. Their underground system had protected them, but it was no match for the fire that now poured into their hiding places. The Japanese soldiers had prepared themselves for many things: heavy bombardments, direct assaults, and even suicide missions, but they had never expected a weapon that could make their hiding places no longer safe. The fear was immediate and overwhelming. Many of the defenders panicked as soon as the flames started to reach their positions. The idea of being trapped in a small, narrow tunnel while fire consumed everything around them was enough to break the spirit of even the most determined soldiers. The flames would spread quickly through the tunnels, filling the confined space with unbearable heat. The smoke would choke the air, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Some soldiers tried to escape, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped with no way to fight back. The psychological effect of facing flamethrowers was severe. For the Japanese, it was one thing to die in battle, but it was another to face a death that was so intense and painful. Many soldiers, unable to escape the flames, chose to take their own lives rather than be burned alive. This was a choice that reflected the extreme pressure they were under. It was a choice driven by fear, but also by a deeply ingrained sense of honor and duty. To face such a fate, trapped in a tunnel and surrounded by fire, was more than many could bear. The psychological toll on the Japanese soldiers was enormous. They had been trained to fight to the death, but this new weapon made that fight even more harrowing. The Japanese commanders were slow to react to the threat posed by flamethrowers. They had not anticipated such a weapon would be used against them in such a way. Initially, they believed that their underground defenses would keep their soldiers safe. But as the flamethrowers continued to devastate their positions, the Japanese commanders realized that they needed to adjust their tactics. However, by the time they understood the full impact of the flamethrowers, it was too late. The Americans had already gained the upper hand, and the Japanese defenders were being pushed deeper into their underground strongholds. Despite the Japanese commanders' attempts to adjust, the flamethrowers had already broken the defensive lines. The flamethrower, though not the only weapon used, had proved to be the most effective at breaking through the entrenched positions. The psychological devastation it caused, along with its effectiveness in clearing out tunnels, turned the tide of the battle in favor of the Americans. For the Japanese defenders, it became clear that the U.S. forces would not be stopped. Their strategy, which had relied so heavily on underground fortifications, had been neutralized by a weapon they could not have predicted. The emotional and psychological effects on both sides were deep. For the U.S. soldiers, the success of the flamethrowers came with a heavy cost. They had to live with the knowledge of what they had done and the suffering they had caused. For the Japanese defenders, the flames represented the worst possible fate, an inescapable, terrifying death that few could face. Both sides had been forced to confront the brutal realities of war in a new and terrifying way. It was a reminder of how warfare can change not only the landscape of a battle but the very nature of the conflict itself. The use of flamethrowers in Okinawa had far-reaching consequences for both the U.S. military and the Japanese forces. For the Americans, the flamethrowers proved to be a game-changing weapon that allowed them to break through the Japanese defenses in the caves and tunnels of the island. The Japanese defenders, who had relied on their underground fortifications to hold back the American advance, found themselves unable to withstand the flames that poured into their positions. The flamethrowers were especially effective in flushing out entrenched troops hiding in these hidden networks, which had previously been immune to artillery and airstrikes. By using this new weapon, the U.S. forces were able to neutralize a critical part of the Japanese defense system. The flamethrowers allowed the Americans to clear out strongholds that had been considered impenetrable. With the tunnels no longer a safe haven, the Japanese were forced to fight on less favorable ground, eventually retreating or being pushed into a corner. The weapon's ability to clear out enemy positions quickly and decisively played a vital role in the eventual capture of Okinawa, which was crucial to the U.S. strategy in the Pacific War. The island was seen as a stepping stone for the planned invasion of Japan itself, and securing it was essential for the Americans to move forward with their operations. Beyond Okinawa, the success of the flamethrowers in clearing entrenched positions had a lasting impact on U.S. military strategy in the Pacific. The ability to deploy flamethrowers, especially in close-quarters combat, became an integral part of future island-hopping campaigns. U.S. forces would use the lessons learned from Okinawa in subsequent battles, recognizing the need for more specialized equipment to deal with entrenched defenders. The flamethrower, in particular, would continue to be used in later Pacific Island battles, where the Japanese defenders often retreated to underground bunkers to fight on. The strategic advantage provided by the flamethrower influenced the way the U.S. military approached urban and island warfare in the years that followed. For the Japanese, the introduction of flamethrowers into the Battle of Okinawa marked a devastating shift in their defensive strategy. The Japanese had heavily relied on their underground networks of tunnels and caves as their main line of defense. These defenses had been designed to protect their soldiers from airstrikes and artillery, but they were not equipped to deal with the close-range, intense fire of flamethrowers. The Japanese military was slow to react to this new threat, and by the time they realized how effectively the U.S. forces were using flamethrowers, it was too late. The Japanese defenders had no answer for the flamethrowers and could do little to stop them from clearing their positions. The impact on the Japanese military was severe. Many soldiers, unable to escape the flames, chose to die by their own hands rather than face the terror of being burned alive. The death toll on the Japanese side was devastating, with entire units wiped out by the flames. The flamethrowers created a psychological blow as much as a physical one. The defenders, once confident in their underground defenses, now faced a weapon that rendered those defenses useless. This shift in tactics forced the Japanese to reconsider their approach, but it came too late to prevent the Americans from gaining the upper hand. The inability of the Japanese to escape or surrender under the pressure of flamethrowers led to a high casualty rate. Many soldiers found themselves trapped in the tunnels, unable to fight back or flee. The psychological toll of being unable to escape the fire and smoke of the flamethrowers, combined with the overwhelming sense of fear, caused some defenders to give up the fight, while others chose suicide rather than face capture. The high number of casualties, especially among those trapped in the caves, meant that the Japanese were unable to replenish their forces effectively. This loss of manpower compounded the challenges they already faced and severely weakened their position. The use of flamethrowers not only helped the U.S. military secure a decisive victory in Okinawa but also marked the beginning of the end for the Japanese defense strategy in the Pacific. The reliance on underground positions, which had once been seen as a stronghold, was no longer viable. The Japanese military had to adapt to a new form of warfare, one in which traditional fortifications could not withstand modern weaponry. The devastating effectiveness of flamethrowers left a lasting mark on both sides and signaled a shift in the way the war would be fought going forward. In the broader strategic context, the use of flamethrowers in Okinawa was a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. It demonstrated the power of specialized weapons in breaking through entrenched defenses and highlighted the need for innovation in warfare. The Japanese, with their reliance on static defenses, could not keep up with the evolving tactics of the U.S. military. The flamethrowers' success made it clear that U.S. forces were prepared to use any means necessary to secure victory, even if it meant employing weapons that would bring unparalleled destruction. For the Japanese, it meant that their defensive strategies were no longer sufficient to withstand the overwhelming firepower of the United States. The toll on both sides was heavy, but for the U.S., the strategic consequences were clear. The way was now open for future operations in the Pacific, and the flamethrower had proven itself to be an invaluable tool in their arsenal. The use of flamethrowers in the Battle of Okinawa became one of the most notorious aspects of the island's bloody conflict. The weapon's brutal effectiveness left a lasting impression on the men who fought there and shaped the way warfare would be viewed in the years to come. For both American and Japanese soldiers, the experience of facing such a devastating weapon had a profound psychological impact. The flames didn't just destroy enemy positions, they scorched the souls of the men who used and witnessed them. The horror of watching entire units burn alive, the screams that filled the air, and the knowledge that their fire could end lives in such a brutal way lingered with soldiers long after the battle ended. For the Americans, the use of flamethrowers created a sense of relief and effectiveness in breaking through the Japanese defenses, but it also led to feelings of guilt and discomfort. The weapon was a symbol of the cruelty of the war. Soldiers who used it were aware that it caused extreme pain and death. While it was an essential tool in securing victory, the men who used it were not immune to the moral dilemma it created. The psychological toll on those who operated the flamethrowers was considerable. Many struggled with the fact that they were using a weapon designed to inflict terror and suffering. For the Japanese defenders, the experience was even worse. The knowledge that they had no way to escape the flames, trapped in tunnels and caves, added a layer of fear and desperation that was unmatched by anything they had encountered before. The post-war impact of flamethrowers was far-reaching. The images of men being burned alive in the caves of Okinawa became part of the darker history of World War II. The weapon's psychological effects on the survivors, both American and Japanese, were profound. Many of the men who fought on Okinawa carried the memory of those flames with them long after the war ended. For the Japanese, the horror of being burned alive in the tunnels led to a significant number of suicides. The fear of facing such a death was enough to make soldiers choose their own end rather than surrender. For the Americans, the success of the flamethrowers in breaking the stalemate was tempered by the grim knowledge of how much suffering the weapon caused. The brutality of flamethrowers was not just a physical reality. It became a part of the psychological landscape of the war. Militarily, the use of flamethrowers in Okinawa set a precedent that would carry over into future conflicts. The success of the weapon in clearing entrenched positions showed how effective it could be in close-quarter combat. Its role in the Pacific War influenced the tactics used in later wars, particularly the Korean War and the Vietnam War. In both of these conflicts, tunnels and fortified positions were common defensive strategies. The flamethrowers' ability to neutralize these defenses made them an important tool in subsequent military operations. In Vietnam, for instance, the dense jungle and extensive tunnel networks that the Viet Cong used made flamethrowers a valuable weapon for U.S. forces trying to clear enemy strongholds. Just as in Okinawa, these tunnels and underground defenses could withstand conventional bombardment, but the flamethrowers could reach into these hidden spaces and flush out the enemy. The legacy of the flamethrower also sparked significant moral and ethical debates. The weapon's horrific effects on both combatants and non-combatants alike made it a source of controversy. The flames caused intense pain, often killing slowly and violently. This led to discussions about the ethics of using such a weapon in combat. While flamethrowers were effective in destroying military targets, their impact on non-combatants, civilians caught in the crossfire, was a serious concern. The use of flamethrowers in Okinawa contributed to an ongoing debate about the morality of certain weapons in war, especially weapons designed to inflict suffering rather than just kill. The psychological toll on soldiers who used flamethrowers was another area of concern. The men who operated them were aware of the weapon's power to cause immense pain and suffering. While they understood its effectiveness in clearing the battlefield, many wrestled with the question of whether the weapon's use was justified. This moral conflict among soldiers, especially those who witnessed the full horror of flamethrower attacks, became an important part of the post-war dialogue on warfare. The psychological scars left by the weapon were not just physical but emotional and mental as well. It raised questions about the lasting effects of combat on soldiers who were tasked with using such brutal weapons. The debate about flamethrowers and their use in warfare eventually made its way into international discussions about the rules of war. The Geneva Conventions, which aimed to limit the brutality of warfare, began to address the use of certain types of weapons, including flamethrowers. The use of such weapons led to greater scrutiny of the laws governing armed conflict. The idea of a weapon that could cause such horrific injuries, especially one that could affect non-combatants, led to a push for more regulation on weapons with similar capabilities. In the years after World War II, the use of flamethrowers would be reconsidered in many military circles, as both the physical and psychological costs became clearer. The legacy of flamethrowers in Okinawa is tied to both the devastating effectiveness of the weapon and the moral and ethical questions it raised. It became a symbol of the brutal nature of warfare in the Pacific, where soldiers were forced to confront not just the physical destruction, but the emotional and psychological toll of their actions. The weapon's role in Okinawa, and later in other wars, would serve as a reminder of the complexities of warfare, where the tools of victory often come with a heavy moral cost. The impact on the soldiers who used the flamethrowers, and the lasting effects on the survivors, made it clear that even the most effective weapons could leave scars that lasted long after the battle was won.